Thank you.
The Student Activities Officer supports and develops engagement and inclusivity in extracurricular activities at the University of York, including societies, media, raising and giving, volunteering and other events. The Student Activities Officer represents more than 200 student groups to the university, lobbying for their interests and making sure that they receive the recognition that they deserve.
Hi everyone, my name's Brooke. I'm the editor of York Vision and I'm here with Carly Precious, who is running for Activities Officer. So we'll get right into it, and I think what everyone wants to know, Carly, is why are you jumping from Community and Wellbeing to run for Activities Officer this year?
So if people knew my last year's manifesto, a big part of it was about mental health. And although we have looked at a lot of those revisions, there has been improvement. It's been vastly impacted by this isolation that students have faced. And the thing is, I don't think anyone quite realised the impact that activity has on student mental health. It impacts their learning, it impacts their emotional health, and it impacts their physical health in so many ways. And that's what's caused me to jump, because I really want us to be engaging and getting involved in activity, because it helps you as an individual, it helps people around you. I mean, we have volunteering and RAG that helps so many other people in the community. And it's just so integral to every part of student life. And it does impact that learning piece. And it's just insane, the impact that it's had over the past year.
So looking at your manifesto and looking at encouraging students to join activity, you talk about moving onto online. However, groups have been doing that for the last few terms now already. So what will be different in the way that you will organise it?
So what I more meant by that is learning the lessons from the online. So I don't think we should ever go back to activity as it was just on its own beforehand. I mean, I think it's been said by quite a few officers over this year, and potentially some of the new candidates, is that it's provided a lot of accessibility and it's provided a lot of options that some students didn't have. However, there is accessibility to the other regard of the technological deprivation and other things. So I guess what I'm wanting to take forward is those lessons from that online. I don't want to just stick with online activity. As I say, we miss that in-person interaction, but there's so much that we can do that we didn't realise we could, and there's so many people that can access that. So it's taking the lessons from that. So rather than just having an in-person Freshers' Fair, let's keep the virtual Freshers' Fair, because there was so much engagement with that. I couldn't attend my first Freshers' Fair, and that was well before the pandemic, because I was working a full-time job and I just happened to have to work those shifts. And that meant that I missed out on a lot of those opportunities in my first year and didn't engage with the union in my first year. It was a lot later in my university days that I actually engaged with the union itself. So it's about creating those options, not taking away one or taking away the other. And I really want to return to activity. And I do want those in-person events. And I'd love to do some really big events and focus maybe some of those events around well-being as well. But it's not to say that I want to be online, it's to say that I want to keep options open for students.
If you were, so say, I mean, of course, like I can't say for certain, but looking at if we were to begin to transition from online to in-person activity as COVID restrictions ease, what can groups expect that to be like?
So I think that's a really complicated one, because it does depend on how fast those different restrictions are relieved. And there is a lot of discussion about space, which is something I talk about in the manifesto. We've obviously not just got, we were struggling for space before. We've had works on Central Hall for several years now. We've been competing with certain end times with the catering services in James College and things like that in certain spaces. We've now got, on top of that, we've got testing centres that are now taking up the sports centre at the moment. So I think that's one of the big battles that we're going to have, an issue for space as we return to campus, particularly flat floor space especially. I mean, I've been dealing with that this week within my role, where a student contacted me saying they were struggling to get a booking for their actual university work as I think it was one of the TFTI students who needs to do a recording for their dissertation piece, but can't do that because there's already societies booked into that space and things like that. And it's going to be a real competition between all the different things that you need from a university experience. So that's going to be one of the big ones. And the other thing is the training. There are people who are now on committees that haven't hosted any in-person events before. And we do have this online collection of training, but that doesn't really prepare you for the in-person. And a lot of people don't know how to access that or where it is, or even realize that we have that as a union. There is a big comms piece. Like, I know people have talked about engagement as well, and how societies don't have the opportunity to publish their events. We've got a page that's dedicated to events on YouTube, but people don't know how to put their events on there. And there's a lot of training to go with to help those societies rebuild their engagement, rebuild their activity, and also keep those regulations list, because it's really important to keep students safe as they return.
So you just briefly mentioned there, and you touched upon it on your manifesto, about society membership dropping. However, I've heard from a few people that what societies are lacking in is actually people to take over committee positions. Do you have any idea of how to encourage people to want to move up to these committee positions and how to get these spaces filled?
So the real big thing is giving them the opportunity to do so, because this year they haven't had the same student experience that we would want in normal years. They don't know what that society group would normally do. We've seen it with a lot of the volunteering projects. So we have quite a few volunteering projects linked to schools, and obviously there's been a lot of health and safety. We've had to shift some of that activity online, and they haven't engaged in the normal way, and that's meant they've been put off committee positions, but we want to return to that activity. So I think it's being able to adapt a little bit and give potentially delaying the re-ratification process, or looking at how we can maybe support those ones that weren't able to re-ratify for some reason, maybe go in a halfway house. And I think that's already happened with some of the volunteering projects. But I'd like that to apply to societies as well. If you're not able to elect your committee for some reason, let's see what new students we get in next year. Let's start give it a go sessions and help you organise those, so that your society doesn't just collapse, but that we can almost bring it back from that brink. Because that's what's missing. Students haven't engaged with society because they haven't seen them on campus. They don't know what their activity is. Imagine being a performance society currently. You haven't performed properly in the normal circumstances. I know I've seen people do some amazing things on Zoom and click things together, but you haven't been in an in-person space and performed in the normal sense. You've got to give the students the opportunity to engage before we just cut them off as such.
Okay, lovely. What will you tackle first if you were to get into the role? What would be your first priority?
So I'm quite lucky with having been in the community and wellbeing role that I sat on a lot of those test, track and trace groups. So the first thing would be looking at how we bring that in line with the COVID rules and adapting to them. Because I've had to keep up to date with all the regulations, I think I'd be able to help societies understand those regulations and help bring them back onto campus. Because that would be the first thing. They need to understand what they can and unfortunately can't do, but it's particularly that can. Because there's so many restrictions in place and they're so confusing to navigate, and that would be the first priority, to get students to understand those rules and regulations so they can do their activity in person and engage those students.
Yeah. Another big issue has been funding. Naturally, funding for groups has gone down. I mean, I'm on the media committee and that has gone down. What will groups expect in regards to funding if you were to get the position of activities officer?
So the thing about funding is we get a big part of UC's grant is on the university, and we have to prove what our activity does and things like that. And there's been so much focus on mental health and getting in practitioners and things like that, but there's very little evidence-based work around how much being in a society group or being in a sports club or being part of the student activity impacts your learning and your mental health in that regard. So it's a big data collection piece, because the thing about funding is you have to prove that there is demand at every turn, and it's so awful because you know that it's there sometimes, but you can't prove that it's there. And that would be what my focus is, trying to prove the impact that students and society groups have on learning, on mental health and all those other things, so that we can bid for that funding and help increase it. We've done some great work with OPPA this year and the Kickstart funds, and they weren't always the easiest thing to get. You had to be adapting to COVID, but I think we need to take that work forward in other areas and prove that connection to that mental health link.
In regards to ratification of societies, obviously last year saw it was quite a hot button topic of various groups wanting to be ratified, including TP UK. If TP UK were to become a fully ratified society, how do you intend on engaging with them?
So obviously a society based in politics, it can be quite difficult. People have quite adverse opinions, and there is this whole concept of freedom of speech. And the union has certain legal obligations regardless of people's political views, and therefore they've got to honour that. And that is why that the society was technically allowed to ratify. Unfortunately, we saw it where there was no committee. There was no one to ratify the society afterwards, and it very quickly, it just never actually became officially ratified. If it were to ratify again and come forward again, I think we'd have to let it do so, and we'd hold it to our standards. We have an inclusive policy where you can't have any of the bullying and other things, and we would hold it to the code of conduct that every society has to stand up for. Every society has to be inclusive, no matter what ethnicity, whether you come from the LGBTQ plus community, whether what you are, you should be able to join any society and feel welcome there. And if they weren't doing that, that goes against our policy, against our code of conduct, and we would start the de-ratification process through that means. We would try to support them first, but that would be what it is. That's how the USU works.
Yeah, lovely. That's great. Really quickly, what makes you best suited for the role in 3 words?
knowledge, experience, and commitment.
Great, lovely, that's thank you. And now we'll go to Harry and Chess in the green room.